My experience over the last 6 months has done a bunch of things in my life. One of them is it has put me in touch with quite a number of black conservatives, which I must tell you, it has changed my understanding of the world substantially, because I knew there were black conservatives, and I always thought, are they confused? Are they not understanding which side they should be on? And that is not what's going on. What is going on is that there is a dialogue, which I couldn't hear at least, which looks at the world. You can view the unfairness in the world two different ways. You can look at it and you can say, well, there's structural unfairness in the world, and the cards that we in this community are dealt are not fair. We're not getting our share of the good cards. Or you can look at the world from the point of view of personal responsibility, and you can say, well, it's kind of an academic question whether the cards you got were fair. You should play them as best you can, given what they are. The thing that I didn't get was one has almost no ability to address the question of how the cards are dealt. It's just not in the range of an individual who discovers that the cards are unfairly dealt can't do very much about that fact. But that individual can do a hell of a lot about their own position in the world by recognizing that actually you, especially if the cards are unfairly dealt, you need to play them very well. And that developing the skill to play them well has the ability to overcome at least some of the unfairness in how they're dealt. And so I have now listened in on this conversation. I've been invited into the conversation amongst some of these black conservatives. And this is what they are really saying, is that there is, from the point of view of where to put one's efforts, dealing on the personal responsibility side pays back better, which I don't think frees us in civilization from addressing the question of how the cards are dealt. I think we should be focused on it. But anyway, it more or less solved the mystery in a way that I thought was quite fascinating. And I'm heartened that they were willing to invite me into that conversation so I could hear it and finally figure out what was going on.
So they advocate towards discipline and personal responsibility as being core tenets that you should reinforce. Right,
and they are very sensitive to the issue of what happens when you focus on the unfairness of how the cards are dealt, which is that, what progressives typically miss is that it really does create a culture of dependency. If you focus on the fact that the cards are unfairly dealt and that's why you're facing a disadvantage, which is largely true, nonetheless, it demotivates you from pursuing success because you recognize that you're starting at a disadvantage and that you're unlikely to win the game. On the other hand, the game isn't what we think. If you can make progress and deliver your kids a head start relative to where you were, that's a win in the game. So anyway, I don't want to trivialize any part of this. I think the unfairness of the way the cards are dealt is really important, and we have obligations to address it. But from the point of view of individuals within a community trying to plot a course, being focused on the personal responsibility side makes a ton of sense.
What are your thoughts on affirmative action?
I've changed my tune. I used to be for affirmative action because it is justified. But now the downsides of it they loom very large for me. And so what I would say is we want to separate the whether or not it is justified to engage in some kind of intentional intervention to fix a problem that has become chronic. And then we separate that from what it is that we are advocating. And I don't think the substitute for it is something that anybody has properly spelled out. But let's just say I would be much more inclined to see a substantial investment in community that makes sense rather than it applied at the individual level. Because I will say, before any of what happened to me at Evergreen happened, I did have the experience of having quite a number of black students in particular who suffered a totally a stigma that had nothing to do with them. Students who did very well on their own merits, who lived in a world that was quick to judge them as having succeeded based on some advantage that, for all I know, they didn't even have. I don't know that any of this, in the role of professor, you don't necessarily know how your student ends up in front of you. But I had no reason. I had some very bright students who I think suffered a stigma that came from the fact that people in general imagined that affirmative action was playing some role in their world that it wasn't. I mean, affirmative action isn't even legal in Washington. So the fact that the stigma appends to people is preposterous in that context in particular.
That's fascinating. I had a friend who was a fireman who told similar stories, and he was talking about the resentment of the other people that were on the fire force if a guy got in, even if a guy was qualified, if a guy was black, because they assumed that he wasn't as qualified, and the reason why he got through it was through affirmative action. He was like, it's so crazy, because what it is they're trying to combat racism by fueling racism. Inadvertently.
Yes, it creates this whole cascade of effects. And so the question really, the civilization-wide question, is what do we do about, and we could retune the analysis for each of the populations in question. In the case of black people in the New World, that is the Americas, most black folks in the New World are here via the route of slavery. And the thing is, slavery was so brutal in destroying the cultures that these people had access to where they came from, and then putting them together in a synthetic culture that was built to serve the masters, right? In other words, denying black folks the ability to learn to read obviously limits access to the huge library of insights that happen to be housed with the population that transported these folks from Africa. So in any case, my point would be that is hobbling. That was intentionally hobbling during slavery. The legacy of that hobbling is one it's hard to quantify. We don't know what role that plays. But I can say any population that has, I'm going to speak now as I do as a biologist. I think of us as robots that have a computer on our shoulders that runs software, and our culture is the software. If you take that robot with the computer and you delete the software package, and then you install some other software package designed to make it do one particular job, that has tremendous harm built into it, and it's reversible. But it is not, I think we know that we didn't succeed in fixing this problem. I think emancipation did not properly deal with how much harm had been done by bringing people from different parts of Africa and pooling them in one population based on effectively skin color alone. And then at the point that they were freed, there was no understanding, because our understanding of biology and culture wasn't sophisticated yet. It still isn't. And so I think we do at some point have to do an honest accounting of how much damage happened in that process. And we also have to realize that damage, I know right now, having been active in trying to make the world a better place, I know that I'm running afoul of an argument called white man's burden, right? And so we all know that this is a narrative. But the point is that white man's burden argument will be wielded against me for even saying this. But nonetheless, I don't see any way around it. I think the real story of what happened in the Americas is not a nice story. And the implications are with us to this day. Nobody knows how deep they go because we haven't studied the question properly. And in fact, many of the people who are on the left pushing this sort of naive narrative about equality are, I think, fearful of what will happen if we study the question.